You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
In fact, the Haudenosaunee, they explicitly opposed the idea of capital punishment, which Keith was kind of so proud to be offering. And they also opposed the idea of incarceration. They said that John Cartledge had been a long time confined, and it was time for him to go free, and that he would be welcomed back into the community at Conestoga now that Keith had finally done what needed to be done.
Hello, and welcome to episode 389 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Early North America was a diverse place. It was a place that contained hundreds of indigenous nations and peoples who spoke at least 2,000 distinct languages prior to European contact. Then, in the early 16th century, Spain began to establish colonies on mainland North America, and they were followed by the French, the Dutch, the English, and the forcible migration of enslaved Africans, who represented at least 45 different ethnic and cultural groups from within Africa. With such diversity, early North America was also a place full of cross-cultural encounters. So what did it look like when people of different ethnicities, races, and cultures interacted with one another? How were the people involved in these cross-cultural encounters able to understand and overcome their differences? Nicole Eustace is an award-winning historian at New York University. Using details from her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Covered with Night, A Story of Murder and Indigenous Justice in Early America, Nicole will take us through one cross-cultural encounter in 1722 between the Haudenosaunee and Susquehannock peoples and the English colonists in Pennsylvania, which involved very different ideas of community and justice. Now, during our investigation, Nicole reveals details about the life and death of Saw-Wantagh, whose death sparked a diplomatic crisis between the English colonists of Pennsylvania and the Susquehannock and Haudenosaunee peoples. Information about the differences that existed between indigenous ideas of justice and English ideas of justice, and how the Haudenosaunee and Susquehannock peoples were able to come to an understanding and reconciliation with the English colonists and the government of Pennsylvania. But first, there's still time to submit your ideas for how we should mark episode 400. This episode will post in December, and we need your help to figure out how we should celebrate. Let me know what you think. Send your ideas to liz@benfranklinsworld.com or post them in our listener community on Facebook. Again, you can post your ideas for episode 400 in our listener community on Facebook or by emailing me at liz@benfranklinsworld.com. All right, are you ready for our cross-cultural investigation? Let's go meet our expert guide. Our guest is a professor of history at New York University who teaches United States and Atlantic history. Her research interests include 18th century North America in the Atlantic world, gender, culture, politics, and the history of emotion. She's the author of several books, including Covered with Night, A Story of Murder and Indigenous Justice in Early America, which won the Pulitzer Prize in History and was a finalist for the National Book Award. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Nicole Eustace.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, Nikki's book, Covered with Night, investigates the 1722 murder of an indigenous man named Saw-Wantagh at the hands of two brothers and British colonists, John and Edmund Cartledge. And then, of course, there was a political crisis that ensued because of this murder. Nikki, would you tell us about Saw-Wantagh and the Cartledges and what happened the night of Saw-Wantagh's murder?
Sure. So John and Edmund Cartledge were two settler colonists in Pennsylvania. They were part of the Quaker community, and they were actually among the very first settler colonists to be born in Pennsylvania rather than to have migrated from England. So they grew up in the Susquehanna Valley region. They always had various native people as neighbors, and they both became fur traders. So they were really part of this kind of intercultural world. Sawantini was a member of the Seneca Nation, which was part of what was then the 5 nations, it's now the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee. And the Susquehanna River Valley, by the time that this murder occurs in 1722, was a place that had experienced a great deal of upheaval. A lot of warfare amongst different native groups, pressure created by the Yamasee War that occurred to the south, but that created potential for raiding for enslaved native captives up into the Pennsylvania region, constant pushing westward by settler colonists. And then, of course, the problems of disease, the problems of livestock encroachment. So what you have in the Susquehanna Valley in this period is this coming together for kind of mutual support of a diasporic gathering of different native peoples, some from Algonquin-speaking groups, some from Iroquoian-speaking groups. So you have this very multicultural, polyglot community, and they had found a relative measure of peace and stability together in the Susquehanna River Valley by 1722. So when Sawantini, a very prominent hunter and a very successful hunter, meets John and Edmund Cartledge at his cabin on the Monocacy River in February of 1722 to trade his furs, this is more or less a kind of a routine interaction between the native inhabitants of the region and settler colonists. But it goes wrong. They get into a disagreement and they come to blows. John and Edmund assaulted Sawantini. After he was already injured, he crawled back to his cabin to get his gun to use in self-defense. Edmund was an incredibly large man. He had overpowered Sawantini and assaulted him, really just beat him mercilessly with the gun. So it's interesting, it was never fired. But they injured him grievously and they left him for dead. And they get on their horses and they go galloping away as fast as they can. Now, Sawantini was married to a woman not from the Seneca Nation, but from the Shawnee Nation, which is an Algonquin group. Her name was Winnie Piwea, and she tended him through the night in the cabin that they shared together. She recorded that he lay down on his bearskin, which was a traditional sleeping mat, but that in spite of everything she could do, when morning came, she discovered that he had passed overnight, and she then left and went to go find help to bury him. So word spreads throughout the region amongst both native peoples and settler colonists that this horrific assault has occurred, and then immediately becomes a crisis. How is this catastrophe going to be resolved?
I think we can tell from the way that you're able to detail this deadly assault that there must be a lot of documentation about Sawantini's murder. And that's not something we normally have or have access to when we talk about the history of Indigenous people or people of color. So, Nikki, would you tell us about the available records for the case of Sawantini's murder?
Yes, well, Pennsylvania is a really fun colony to research in because Quakers were inveterate record keepers, and they kept all kinds of notes on this case, from very formal notes kept by the colonial secretary, a man named James Logan, who kept the provincial council minutes of Pennsylvania, to court depositions about the case as it went forward. There was also loads of correspondence created by colonists. And this, don't forget, Pennsylvania is a proprietary colony. It's actually owned by the descendants of William Penn. He had passed away in 1718. But his widow and his sons are the rightful owners of the colony, and they're absentee owners. They're living back in England. So everyone is writing to them to catch them up on what's happening. Meanwhile, the British Board of Trade is keeping an eye on this colony because whenever a proprietor dies, this is a moment of instability. They want to see what's happening in colonial Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had very rivalrous relationships with neighboring colonies, with Maryland, with New York, and those governors are also casting an anxious eye towards Pennsylvania, particularly when they hear about this case, and they're worried that regional stability could be really upended by this act of violence. So those governors are writing to the Board of Trade. So you have this very, very kind of dense, multi-layered set of records. And there are also newspaper records in Pennsylvania because it has a weekly paper by this time. So how does that give us access to the native world and to native thinking? Well, James Logan was an extraordinarily literate man, and he wrote down what everyone said for a couple of decades. And he took the unusual step, and it's very unusual, of actually recording the names of the speakers. So that if you go through decades of the minutes of the Provincial Council of Pennsylvania, you can actually follow native representatives through the years and see over time what they are saying and actually really get to know specific people and specific personalities. And then I would say that there has been such a kind of a flowering of work in Native American and Indigenous studies that remarks that taken out of context might not seem that meaningful. I now know, because of the work of so many of my colleagues, oh, this thing that you might have read past without even thinking about it before is actually very, very resonant in Native culture.
Well, let's investigate this murder and the repercussions that it set off. As Nikki stated, Silwan Taney's murder took place outside of his home near Conestoga, Pennsylvania, which is located about 60 miles west of Philadelphia. Nikki, what should we know about Conestoga, Pennsylvania? What do we need to know about this town and the different peoples who lived there if we want to understand the setting of this murder?
As I was saying in response to your first question, this is a multicultural, polyglot community. I think the most important thing is to realize that members of many Native nations are living peacefully side by side, and settler colonists are living in their midst. So most settler colonists preferred to live in Philadelphia if they could. So most of the kind of leaders of the colony are living in Philadelphia. But a man like James Logan is also surveying lands in Conestoga. And William Keith, the governor of the colony, wants to claim land there. And of course, the Cartledges themselves, as well as a variety of other traders. This is kind of an economy that's really focused on trade at this point. Yes, there is also farming happening, but trade is the source of capital. It's the connection to Atlantic markets. And so these relationships, these trading relationships, were very important for both Native people who were very kind of sophisticated consumers of English material goods, and for colonists who didn't have a lot else to trade to gain currency and to be able to participate kind of in the Atlantic consumer world that's really starting to develop by the first few decades of the 18th century.
What was it like to conduct this trade in Conestoga? It sounds like Conestoga was a place where Native nations and colonists could live peacefully, and that trade made up an essential part of their mutual community life, with English goods coming in from the port of Philadelphia and then making their way 60 miles west to Conestoga. So what did this trade look like in Conestoga? What English goods were Indigenous people interested in? And how were these goods transported from the port of Philadelphia? Because as we know, transportation in early America, especially in 1722, was a bit of a problem. There weren't a lot of good roads.
Yeah, well, Indigenous people are interested in a broad variety of goods. They're certainly interested in guns, primarily for hunting, but also for warfare. And they were interested to a degree in alcohol, which was frequently offered as payment for furs. At the same time, by 1722, they were very well aware of the detrimental effects of alcohol. And in the same period that this murder occurred, there were very concerted diplomatic efforts on the part of Native leaders to stop the traffic, and that is the word they used, the traffic in rum. Besides guns and alcohol, a huge variety of things. English fabrics, English woolens were very much sought. The English called them blankets, kind of pejoratively, but these were wraps that could be used in a variety of ways. And Native people had particular preferences in terms of the colors and the patterns that they wanted to see on these so-called strouds. That's the 18th century word for this kind of cloth. And then a whole variety of other kinds of items, copperware, ironware, mirrors, drinking glasses. And the interesting thing is that Native people sometimes used these goods in the same way that the English would, and sometimes they created their own kind of uses for them.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there were political ramifications of Sawantani's murder for the colony of Pennsylvania, and that these political ramifications could also impact the trade relations. So would you tell us about the politics of Sawantani's murder?
Sure. So as I've said, the Yamasee War, which was focused in South Carolina but really rippled outward, had only just ended in 1718. And that was a war that created tremendous stress for Native peoples, but also obviously instability in the world of settler colonists as well. Things are just kind of beginning to settle down, and really no one on any side wanted this murder to create a new round of instability. Many settler colonial wars began with an instance of murder. So everyone knew this could be the spark to light the tinder. And because of that, there were really concerted efforts to contain the damage. Now, settler colonists thought that the best way to really resolve things would be to assure leaders at Conestoga, and then when they realized that the Five Nations was taking an interest in this, leaders of the Five Nations, that they would give Native people, quote, the full measure of English justice. That was the phrase that they used. And what they meant by the full measure of English justice was that the Cartledge brothers would be arrested, they would be jailed while being held for trial, and they would be put on trial for their lives. If found guilty, they would be subjected to capital punishment, exactly as if one colonist had killed another. So Governor Keith sends representatives of the colony off to Conestoga to explain that this is the procedure he intends to follow. Well, Native leaders at Conestoga immediately say, no, that is actually not how we resolve a crisis of murder when it occurs between friends and allies. Yes, if a murder occurred imposed by an enemy, Native people might very well send out a war party to try to take captives from the enemy to kind of counteract their losses. But when a murder occurs between friends and allies, there is a set of ritual responses that is meant to answer the suffering that the victims' survivors are going through. And that's a multifaceted process that includes emotional components. Native people wanted to be offered condolences for their grief, a spiritual component to go through rituals of reconciliation and repair so that these condolences were not an informal thing at all. They needed to be offered in person in a ritual way. So emotional aspects, spiritual aspects, and material aspects. Native people wanted to be paid reparations, and that's an 18th century word. That is the word in the sources, that the people of Conestoga wanted to be paid reparations, and that ultimately was also the position of the Five Nations as well. So there are two diametrically opposed ideas about how to resolve this crisis and what the practice of justice actually looks like.
Yeah, it really sounds like the English and Native nations had two very different ideas of justice for reconciliation in 1722. Nikki, I do wonder if you could tell us more about the Five Nations and the Five Nations Confederacy to which the Seneca belonged. Because it seems like if the English really want to avoid another war with indigenous peoples, they're going to have to work through the Five Nations or negotiate with the people of Conestoga in a way that the Five Nations would approve, because they're an especially powerful people in the early 18th century. So would you help us understand the urgency on behalf of all the different peoples involved to find a diplomatic solution to these different ideas of justice in the Sawantani murder case?
That's such a great question, because what we think of as New York today really was Iroquois in 1722. to the point that if you look at formal maps printed in London in 1721, just the year before this case occurred, the Iroquois are written on the map in all caps, even bigger than the names of any of the colonies. The English realized that the Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee, which following the French they called the Iroquois, they realized that the Iroquois are the regional power. And that's not only recognized in London, in the halls of the Board of Trade, but it's also recognized in Pennsylvania. So we were talking earlier about the very rich kind of documentary record for this case. One of the things that I found at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and it was just a fabulous kind of find, was a hand-drawn map that James Logan, who was himself a fur trader, had created showing this very, very rudimentary schematic of the rivers of the Ohio River Valley. And then in very, very large script on this map is this runs to the Iroquois. So the Iroquois really are the native power on the ground in the region. And what they say has incredible import because they were also very influential on smaller native nations. From the Susquehanna River Valley, native nations from both Algonquin groups and Iroquoian groups were already in the habit of seeking alliance with and protection from the Five Nation of the Haudenosaunee. They made regular diplomatic visits to great kind of gatherings that were hosted by the Haudenosaunee in Iroquois outside Albany. And the Five Nations, in turn, could call on the peoples of the Susquehanna River Valley to take up arms in cases where there were conflicts with either other native groups or with settler colonists. So they really were the power in the region.
So thinking about this crisis, we're really dealing with two big issues. The first issue is that Sewantanee's murder endangered peaceful relations and diplomatic ties between the English in Pennsylvania and the wider British government with the Five Nations peoples. And the second crisis would seem to be more intercolonial between at least Pennsylvania and New York, because from all the research I did about Albany, New Yorkers really didn't like it when colonists from other colonies came into the region and interacted with the Haudenosaunee without their knowledge or without the use of their Albany-based Indian agents. New York was actually really particular in that it wanted to control every interaction in dealing with the Haudenosaunee and to have those interactions and dealings go through its Indian agents in Albany. So, Nikki, we've identified these two big problems with this crisis. Were there any other ramifications of this Pennsylvania murder for colonies like New York or New England? And were other colonies upset that Pennsylvanians really could upset their relationships with the Haudenosaunee people?
Absolutely. One of the things people don't realize is how disunited the British colonies were in this period. When representatives from Pennsylvania ultimately went to Albany to meet leaders of the Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee to try to resolve the case, they were referred to by New Yorkers in their correspondence as foreigners. So it's not just that they were separate colonies, they were actually regarded as separate peoples. And you're quite right that in New York, the governor there and his colleagues, if we could call them that, really wanted to dominate the relationship with the powerful Five Nations. And they were not at all happy that things were being complicated by the actions of a couple of fairly small potatoes Pennsylvania fur traders in the Susquehanna Valley.
So the murder of Sewantanee wasn't just a murder and awful within itself. This was an event that had truly big political ramifications for all the different relationships that British Americans had with the powerful Haudenosaunee people. Now that we have an idea for the political atmosphere in the aftermath of Sewantanee's murder, we should really discuss how the English and the Haudenosaunee were able to negotiate themselves out of this political dicey situation. But first, let's take a moment for our episode sponsor. As we get ready to commemorate, celebrate, and reflect on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, we should remember that we're part of a longer tradition of marking these historic occasions. For example, 200 years ago, Americans prepared to commemorate 50 years of American independence and democracy. As part of their commemoration, they invited the Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of two worlds, to return to the United States to help them mark the occasion. On August 16, 1824, Lafayette arrived in New York Harbor and disembarked to a crowd of more than 80,000 Americans lining the streets of Manhattan. Lafayette's landing in New York marked the start of a 13-month tour of the United States, which at the time consisted of 24 states. Now, none of us were alive 200 years ago to witness this grand event and celebration, but we can witness a recreation of parts of Lafayette's grand tour in 2024 and 2025. On August 16, 2024, in honor of the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's grand tour of the United States, the American Friends of Lafayette organization will kick off a recreation of Lafayette's return to the United States. To learn more about Lafayette 200 and how and where you can attend one of its events, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Lafayette 200. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Lafayette 200. Nikki, what did the governor of Pennsylvania, William Keith, do in this political dicey situation? What was his plan for making good on Sewanteeni's murder and making reconciliation with the Haudenosaunee people?
So William Keith is quite a character. He was an Anglican, and he was appointed by William Penn's Anglican widow. And he arrives in the colony upon the death of William Penn and is met with a lot of skepticism by the Quaker leaders still in the colony, men like James Logan and a friend of his, Isaac Norris, and quite a few others that I get to describe in the book. He's met with a tremendous amount of skepticism. Those were men that had been good friends with William Penn for many decades, who really shared his outlook on the world, and they had absolutely no real respect for Keith. Keith was flamboyant. He was a fortune hunter. He was actually a member of the nobility. He was a baronet and entitled to use the title Sir William, which really got under the skin of these upper middle class but merchant class Quakers who were not ennobled and in fact really liked the more egalitarian, almost Republican leaning aspects of government in Pennsylvania, where from the beginning, William Penn had created a charter that allowed for a legislature to pass laws for the colony. So William Keith, there's a portrait of him. He's got this enormous flowing curly black wig. He poses in metal armor, like a knight of old, even in 1722. Keith is this very flamboyant guy, and he's literally entitled. And his idea is that he's just going to kind of make this go away. He has an idea of justice that's a seigneurial idea of justice based on kind of Old English lordship. He thinks that he himself can just kind of decide what's going to happen to the cartilages. He certainly wants to placate Native people, and placate is the right word in capturing Keith's viewpoint. He does not have a lot of respect for Native people at all. And John Cartledge actually has a couple of useful cards up his sleeve, including the fact that he thinks he's found mineral deposits on land in the Susquehanna River Valley that belongs to Native people, but that is unclaimed by colonists. After he's jailed, he tips Keith off to the possibility of this land that might be the source of fabulous mineral wealth. Keith actually springs John Cartledge from jail so that Cartledge can ride off into the backcountry with him and locate some of these potential mineral deposits. So Keith, he wants to placate Native people. He doesn't take their demands very seriously. And he thinks that he could just kind of massage the whole situation for his own personal profit. And I should say, he's an aristocrat, but he's an impoverished aristocrat. The only thing he inherited from his father, besides the title, was a mountain of debt. And so he really wants to find a way to make a fortune. By contrast, James Logan and the other Quaker merchants, as I've said, have a much more kind of Republican style of government in mind. And they want to see English common law principles govern this case. And they want a very regularized trial that is not going to give Keith undue influence over the outcome. So there's actually kind of a triangle with Native people having one idea about justice, Keith having this kind of noblesse oblige seigneurial plan to just control the situation and manipulate it for his own benefit. and the Quakers wanting to see a more kind of legalistic, statute-based approach to this case.
You also reminded us earlier that Pennsylvania was a proprietary colony and that the Penn family owned and really governed it. Did the Penn family have any influence on a fourth idea of justice that this situation had to contend with?
I don't think there's a fourth idea, but what happens is that the mutual suspicion between Governor Keith, James Logan, and his closest friend Isaac Norris mounts very, very rapidly. And they start sending rival tattletale letters back to the widow Penn and her closest associates in London, each trying to paint themselves in the best possible light as they get involved in increasingly conflicting approaches to the case. So that was part of the fun for me as a historian, was to try to kind of suss out what was really going on here. Ultimately, it seems pretty clear that the Quakers were playing a much more by-the-books game, and Keith was getting very creative. I would love to talk about the Native representative, if you'd like to get into that.
Yeah, that would be great, because as we know, throughout history, in order to come to a resolution, all parties have to come together in some way. So how did the Seneca and the Haudenosaunee push their case that the real answer to this whole situation was to follow their ritual response between allies, which involved reconciliation and reparations? So how did the Haudenosaunee make themselves heard with all these differing ideas of English justice?
So it's important to remember, as we were talking about it before, that the Susquehanna River Valley is a multicultural native space. There are people who are affiliated with the Five Nations of the Haudenosaunee, as well as Iroquoian speakers that are not part of the Five Nations, as well as a variety of different Algonquin groups. The Haudenosaunee base of power was in Iroquois, what we would now call New York. And because the Five Nations were such a strong group, they're exercising influence all the way from New York down to the Susquehanna River Valley. But the Susquehanna River Valley is not really their primary space. That space, the Susquehanna River Valley, the Conestoga community, was actually represented by a man who had connections to all of these groups, but it's hard to say exactly which group would have been his primary affiliation. His name was Taquataranzali. The English called him Captain Civility. And Taquataranzali's ethnicity is hard to determine because colonists didn't really understand what exactly his affiliations were. At some points, they said that he was Susquehannocks descent, and the Susquehannock nation gave their name to the Susquehanna Valley. They were an Iroquoian-speaking group that was never formally affiliated with the Five Nations. They actually were sometimes in conflict with the Five Nations and were ultimately absorbed by the Five Nations. He was sometimes described as, quote, reputed to be of a Cayuga descent. And the Cayuga, of course, were formal members of the Five Nations. So we don't know precisely what his background was. What is more important is that among many different Native groups, diplomats, people who acted as go-betweens, frequently would claim membership in more than one nation at the same time. And that was to emphasize their role in bringing disparate people together in one community. So we were talking earlier about, well, what are the sources for Native perspectives on justice? One of the important sources for getting at Indigenous intellectual history is Indigenous language. And in the Susquehannock language, that sound, taqua, is linked to the root for ataqua, meaning shoes. And Indigenous diplomats were people who wore shoes or moccasins, walking the back and forth between different peoples and trying to bring them together as a single community. If you start thinking about the fact that Taquataranzali's name is derived from this idea of shoe leather diplomacy, to use a modern phrase, it's interesting to think, well, why did the English call him Captain Civility? This was something that absolutely intrigued and puzzled me as I was working on this case. Prior historians have thought about it. Some of them have thought it was a joke, kind of just sarcastic. because colonists would often use derogatory language describing indigenous people as savages. So, let's call this man Captain Civility. Others thought it was a sincere compliment because of his diplomatic work, but that it was a name that was conferred by colonists. What I discovered in the course of my research, by looking not just at records originating in Pennsylvania, but looking at records from surrounding colonies, was that Captain Civility was not a personal name at all. It was a job title. And it was a job title that was used by generations of Susquehannock diplomats. Captain Civility was a title conferred on a person who had military prowess and could be a military leader, that's the captain part, but whose primary role was to bring people together in civil society, to create communal connections between peoples. And so Captain Civility is the best kind of early modern English translation of this Sioux diplomat, Taquatarin-Sali. So Taquatarin-Sali was the chief spokesperson for the people of the Susquehanna River Valley, the Conestoga community, and he was the first person to tell the colonists that they wanted to regard this as a conflict between friends and allies, not as an act of aggression by enemies.
What did the negotiations with the English look like for Taquatarin-Sali and the Susquehannock? And where did those negotiations take place? Because that often symbolizes power and who might hold the upper hand. So did negotiations take place in Philadelphia at the seat of colonial power? Did they occur where the Seneca and Haudenosaunee Confederacy would have wanted them to occur? Or did they take place right in Conestoga?
Well, this is a fascinating question as well. Where did he go? Well, the colonists have one idea about how this landscape is divided. Maryland is here, and then north of Maryland is Pennsylvania. They don't actually agree where the border is. There are a lot of border disputes right now between the colonies. Pennsylvania kind of melts into New Jersey, and then someplace after New Jersey comes New York. That's the colonial conception. But in fact, all of this remains native ground. And native people are traversing across these colonial boundaries. So Salwantani's cabin on the Monocacy River was actually right on that disputed border between Maryland and Pennsylvania. And when his friends and neighbors discovered that he had died, the first thing that they did was send emissaries to colonial Maryland to talk to the governor there. And it was that first group, the very first kind of knowledge of this crime to come to settler colonists went to Maryland, not to Pennsylvania. That group is the group that said, according to the notes taken in Maryland, that they wish to receive, quote, reparations. There then were many, many meetings. The first meeting to be held to try to resolve the crisis was actually convened in the community of Conestoga by none other than John Cartledge. Cartledge, having grown up in the community, actually understood a lot more about Native protocols than Governor Keith did, who had literally just arrived in the colony and was still trying to get up to speed. And Cartledge knew that the first step in making amends for this crime was to hold a communal gathering, to offer condolences, to host a feast. He probably also knew, and if he didn't know then, he learned quickly, that it's not one and done with Native people. The English were looking for kind of a fast resolution, a one-time solution. Native people, because their focus is on building confidence building, creating new community ties, they expected the process of making reparations and going through these rituals of repair to be something that would occur on a sustained basis over a prolonged period of time.
When you read Covered with Night, you'll find out that William Keith eventually went to Albany, New York to meet with the Haudenosaunee and its leaders to discuss this case. Nikki, what happened during Keith's big meeting with the Haudenosaunee? Was he able to convince them to avoid war and about the merits that he saw in English justice when he tried to seek reconciliation on behalf of the English for Salwantani's murder?
Keith did not persuade them in any way, shape, or form. In fact, the Haudenosaunee leaders in New York really schooled Keith in Native approaches to justice. They told him that one life, this is a quote, "one life is enough to be lost. There should not more die for this." They explicitly opposed the idea of capital punishment, which Keith was kind of so proud to be offering. And they also opposed the idea of incarceration. They said that John Cartledge had been a long time confined and it was time for him to go free, and that he would be welcomed back into the community at Conestoga now that Keith had finally done what needed to be done, shown up in person to go through these rituals of repair, to offer condolences, and to pay reparations. And he went to Albany with a very substantial package of trade goods to offer the leaders of the Haudenosaunee. So they really let him know on no uncertain terms that they did not share his view of justice. So Keith is thinking about individual crime, individual punishment. Native people are thinking about community rupture and community repair.
One thing I'm really curious about, when we read within the larger scope of Indigenous history and relations with the English, especially very early on, as in 1722, we read that the English were very reluctant to offer execution of Englishmen in exchange for having had Englishmen kill Indigenous people. They were reluctant to offer a life for a life, so to speak. So should we be giving Keith and the colonists of Pennsylvania any credit that they put execution of the Cartledges on the table for the Haudenosaunee?
I write this book as kind of a dramatic narrative. I came to the conclusion that neither Keith nor the Quakers ever had any real intention of executing the Cartledge brothers. These were their close friends and business associates. They wanted to put a good face on things and, as I say, placate Native people. They had a million different dodges, legal stratagems through which they would have attempted to get the Cartledges off easy if it had actually come to that. Legal scholars will tell you that a first offense of this kind that occurred really by accident in a moment of anger should have been tried as manslaughter, not murder in the first place. But again, just like colonial borders are very vague, so is colonial law. What's interesting is that when Keith came to Pennsylvania in 1718, he pushed through a major draconian revision of the Pennsylvania Penal Code and created a long list of crimes that he subjected to capital punishment, including witchcraft, arson, and a variety of other things that had never been considered capital crimes under the more mild government of William Penn. So they don't really know exactly what the law is. And Keith very loudly and repeatedly in writing asserted that he would execute the colonists. So he was claiming this was a capital case. I doubt they would have ever actually put the Cartledges to death.
And that's quite a contrast in intentions, because the way you described how the meeting went in Albany, the Haudenosaunee seemed to be acting in good faith. They agreed to welcome the Cartledges back to Conestoga and allow them to continue to be part of the community there. And then they held these inclusive ceremonies to repair the relationship between the community in the Susquehanna River Valley and the English. But the English, if the parties had followed the English path to justice, it's likely these dealings wouldn't have been in good faith because the English knew all the loopholes in English law, and that would have put the Haudenosaunee at a disadvantage for seeking English redress for Sewantanee's murder. So if the Haudenosaunee had pursued justice through English justice, they probably wouldn't have received any justice for Sewantanee's murder.
That's exactly right. So had they followed the English plan, there would have been no formal condolences, no rituals of repair, no payment of reparations. And then it really might have become the occasion for a regional war. The truth is that the Haudenosaunee were not interested in warfare with the colonists. The Haudenosaunee were just interested in peaceful trade as anyone else was. But had their interests not been addressed, things could have gone in a very different direction.
Now, the negotiation held between the Haudenosaunee and Governor Keith resulted in the Treaty of 1722. Nikki, would you tell us about that treaty and what it accomplished?
So the really important thing here is to realize that The Haudenosaunee were really the dominant diplomatic force in the region, not only amongst native nations that made regular visits to meet with leaders of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, but also among the colonists themselves. The 5 nations were in the habit of hosting annual diplomatic meetings at Albany in which they convened people for these kinds of bilateral meetings, shared meals, shared feasts in which any kind of outstanding conflicts or issues could be resolved. And again, I'm using this kind of modern phrase of confidence building. It was about building an inclusive relationship over time. And this was a process in which the Haudenosaunee were really playing the dominant role. There, the centrality of Albany as a diplomatic meeting place would continue for many more decades, even up to something like the Albany Congress in 1754, which was the first time that the 13 colonies attempted to try to unite with one another rather than regarding each other as foreign rivals. So the Haudenosaunee are really creating a diplomatic center, not only for native nations, but also for colonists. And this Treaty of 1722 records the history and the outcome of this case. At the same time, the Haudenosaunee reassured people of Pennsylvania that the Haudenosaunee would not claim the lands of the Susquehanna River Valley. And the settler colonists were very keen to kind of ratify, justify their land claims. The truth is, as I have tried to make clear, the Haudenosaunee were very influential in the Susquehanna River Valley, but they were not the owners of the land in any kind of legal sense. So to an important extent, that assurance of Pennsylvania colonies' land rights in the Susquehanna River Valley was almost meaningless. Nevertheless, the settler colonists were quite pleased to receive it, and so they preserved the treaty. And the treaty was never abrogated. It's the oldest continuously recognized treaty in Anglo-American law. It is still in effect today. And I find that really exciting because it records the Indigenous approach to justice, which is based on this ideal of community repair. And it's an important part of our collective heritage that has for a long time been buried.
That's actually a really good segue, because before we move into the time warp, I am curious why you think this story of Seawantani's murder is important and why you chose to write a book about it. Or I guess another way I could ask this is, what do you want us readers to take away from Covered with Night?
I found the case fascinating. I felt that I could really see all of these different characters, the settler colonists and the Indigenous people, as full 3-dimensional people. We've really only scratched the surface of a couple of the biggest. I think of them as characters, but they were real people. If you read the book, you will meet many more settler colonists, other leaders, as well as ordinary colonists, indentured servants, the wives of many of these men who played important roles, many different Indigenous diplomats and Native people as well. And so the chance to create kind of a collective biography of this cross-cultural world was really an exciting one. And I do think that it really turns conventional ideas about savagery and civility on their head. You see how deeply thought through Native approaches to justice were, and how very self-interested colonists were as they pursued what they chose to label justice while they were, secretly hoping to make a fortune in mineral rights.
We should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Nikki, what do you think would have happened if one or both of the Cartledge brothers had actually been executed for the murder of Seawantani? If the parties involved had followed that English justice model, do you think this political crisis would have erupted into a war, or do you think it would have just taken a different path?
It really depends, I think, whether or not the settler colonists would have followed other aspects of Native protocol. In other words, if they had offered condolences, met in rituals of repair multiple times over many months, and paid reparations, but still executed one of the colonists, I think that Native leaders would definitely have been displeased, but I don't think they would have necessarily gone to war over it or taken action against the settler colonists. If the settler colonists had simply executed their own and declared that justice had been served and nothing else had to be done, and not paid any reparations or engaged in any ritual condolences, then I think it really might have sparked war.
Nikki, I'm curious where you're going next with your research, because you always seem to be working on some fascinating story or another.
Well, I am working on something new. It's very new, and I tend to write a book every 8 or 10 years, so I'm a long ways out yet. It will be another book about cross-cultural conflict between settler colonists and Indigenous people. It'll be a late 18th century book, and I hope to write it in a kind of dramatic narrative style. I'm thinking of a kind of a wilderness thriller.
Fantastic. And if we have more questions about the murder of Saw-Wantagh and the cross-cultural conflict that you investigated in your book Covered with Night, where's the best place for us to get a hold of you and ask our questions?
You can always find me on the NYU website. I'm in the history department, and you can find me there.
Nicole Eustace, thank you for taking us through the murder of Saw-Wantagh and the differing ideas of justice that Indigenous peoples and English colonists had.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to talk with you. It's just been a lot of fun, and I really appreciate the great questions.
Anglo-American law has a long history of treaty making with Indigenous peoples, and the Treaty of 1722 represents the oldest continuous treaty in this legal tradition. Now, as Nikki showed us, treaties often result from cross-cultural encounters. Treaties are formal, legally binding agreements between sovereign states or nations, and treaties establish obligations and rights between the parties involved, and they can cover a wide range of subjects. Now, the cross-cultural encounter that gave rise to the Treaty of 1722 was the Cartledge brothers' murder of a Seneca man named Saw-Wantagh during a dispute over trade. For the English, justice for Saw-Wantagh meant the arrest and jailing of the Cartledge brothers, a trial, and possibly punishment in the form of execution. For the Susquehannock and Haudenosaunee peoples, justice meant acknowledging Saw-Wantagh's death, repairing the damage and pain caused by his death with proper condolence rituals, and the payment of reparations. As Nikki related during our conversation, it took a lot of time and effort to overcome the differences between these two views of justice for Saw-Wantagh. And complicating this process were the personal needs and desires of Governor William Keith and the Quaker merchants and land speculators. In the end, the situation came to a resolution when Governor Keith traveled to Albany, New York, and met with Haudenosaunee leaders. Through negotiations, Governor Keith and the people of Pennsylvania offered the required condolences for Saw-Wantagh's death and paid his people reparations in the form of English trade goods. In exchange for the reparations and the condolences, the Cartledge brothers and their fellow colonists were forgiven. The Pennsylvanians received assurances about Haudenosaunee claims to lands in the Susquehanna River Valley, and another costly war between the English and Indigenous peoples was avoided. Now, what I loved about our conversation was how Nikki peeled back the layers of a historical source, a treaty, a document that at first blush might appear to be old, forgotten, and a boring artifact of the past. But by taking a serious look at the treaty and peeling back its layers, Nikki was able to show us the three-dimensional world of Saw-Wantagh and the Cartledges, a world that was filled with cross-cultural interactions and cross-cultural negotiations that allowed for many different peoples to live and interact with each other in North America. You'll find more information about Nikki, her book, Covered with Night, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/389. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, Jordan Hammond, Ashley Bachnight, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other cross-cultural interactions in early America would you like to explore? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.